What if I told you the real reason avoidant people pull away has very little to do with you and much more to do with what feels safe inside them? Most people don't understand this until things have already started to fall apart. You might think you understand avoidant people. You might think you know why they go quiet, why they distance themselves, why they suddenly feel cold when things start getting deeper or more real. But the truth is, most of that understanding is incomplete, because what you've been told is only half the story, and what you assume they want from love is often not accurate. If you don't truly understand what's happening beneath their behavior, you end up repeating the same painful cycle again and again. You get close, they step back. You panic, they withdraw more. And in the end, the connection breaks, leaving you confused about what went wrong. But here is what most people never hear clearly. Avoidant people are not running away from love itself. They are running away from what feels unsafe to them. That is a very different thing. And this is where most relationships fail with them. Not because of lack of love, but because of misunderstanding. You don't recognize the kind of emotional environment they are actually sensitive to. It's not the obvious things you try harder and harder to give. It's deeper than that. It's subtle emotional pressure, intensity without balance, or a feeling of being emotionally overwhelmed. When someone with avoidant tendencies feels that shift, they don't always think logically. They react internally. They start to create space, not because you are wrong, but because their system is trying to protect itself. And if you've ever felt someone slowly pull away from you, if you've ever been told you are too emotional or too much, or if you've ever questioned your worth because someone kept moving out of reach, then this is something you need to understand clearly. Because once you understand what actually matters to them, your entire perspective shifts. The way you see yourself shifts. The way you respond in relationships shifts. When I talk about staying emotionally grounded, I'm not talking about acting like you don't care. I'm not talking about suppressing your needs or pretending everything is fine. I'm talking about something much stronger than that. It's the ability to stay connected to yourself even when the other person disconnects from you. Most people lose themselves at that moment. When someone pulls away, the nervous system reacts immediately. Thoughts start racing. You replay conversations. You analyze tone. You search for what you did wrong. You start turning their distance into a reflection of your worth. But that reaction is not truth. It's old emotional fear speaking. Being grounded means you don't let that fear take over your behavior. You pause before reacting. You separate facts from anxiety. You understand that someone stepping back can come from their own emotional wiring, not from your lack of value. Avoidant individuals are often used to emotional reactions being intense and overwhelming. In their experience, closeness can feel like pressure. So when they create distance, they expect pursuit, panic, questions, or emotional escalation. But when they don't get that reaction, something changes. When you stay steady, calm, and rooted in yourself, it creates something unfamiliar for them. Instead of chaos, they experience stability. Instead of pressure, they experience space without emotional consequence. That grounded presence doesn't chase, doesn't collapse, and doesn't try to force closeness back. It simply stays centered. It communicates without words. I'm still here, but I'm not going to lose myself. And that is rare. Most people respond to distance with anxiety and pursuit. But emotional groundedness creates a completely different dynamic, one that feels safer, not suffocating. And it sends a clear signal: you are not a threat. They don't panic when an avoidant needs space. They don't turn every shift in energy into a crisis. Instead, they hold themselves with enough inner strength that the avoidant finally feels like they can breathe again. And this is something avoidant individuals often crave without even knowing how to explain it. Someone who doesn't collapse when distance appears. Someone who doesn't chase out of fear. Someone who can stay emotionally present without becoming overwhelming. Someone who can hold space without adding pressure to it. Think about a moment when someone you cared about pulled away. Maybe you reacted from fear without even realizing it. You sent another message. You over-explained yourself. You apologized for things that weren't even clear. You tried to restart the connection, to fix the silence, to pull things back to how they were. But the more you reached, the more distant they became. And it's important to understand this wasn't because you lacked value or because you did something fundamentally wrong. In many cases, your reaction simply confirmed something already stored in their emotional system. That closeness can feel intense, and intensity can feel unsafe. Now imagine the same moment handled differently. You still feel the fear, but you don't let it control your behavior. You allow space without abandoning your own self-worth. You don't punish them, you don't panic, and you don't try to force emotional closeness back into place. You stay steady, you stay open, you stay grounded. That kind of response creates a completely different emotional experience for them because it disrupts the pattern they expect. Instead of chaos, they meet calm. Instead of pressure, they meet space without consequence. Instead of emotional escalation, they meet stability. And that stability starts to challenge something deep inside them, the belief that closeness always leads to overwhelm or emotional loss of control. When nothing breaks when they step back, something shifts. When you remain balanced instead of reactive, it creates a small but meaningful crack in their emotional defenses. That is what groundedness does. It creates emotional safety without needing to say it directly. And emotional safety is often what avoidant individuals struggle to recognize, even though it is what they need most. When you stay centered, they begin to slowly experience something new in relationships with you. Space doesn't feel like punishment. Closeness doesn't feel like pressure. Connection doesn't feel like something that will trap them. Instead, it starts to feel survivable, steady, manageable. That doesn't mean you ignore your needs. It means you express them from a regulated place. You respond instead of react. You communicate instead of collapse. You stay honest without turning fear into urgency. Something as simple as, I care about this connection, I'm here, and I'm open to talk when you are ready, but I'm also staying grounded in myself, carries a completely different emotional weight than chasing or over-explaining. That kind of energy is powerful because it is self-contained. It doesn't demand, it doesn't shrink, and it doesn't spiral. It simply stands. And people feel that, even if they never consciously name it. Especially those who are used to emotional extremes. Because avoidant patterns are often built around expectation of reaction. They expect pursuit when they withdraw. They expect pressure when they need space. They expect emotional consequences when they don't meet someone's expectations. So when they don't receive that, when instead they are met with calm presence and emotional steadiness, it creates a completely different internal experience, relief. For once, they are not responsible for managing someone else's emotional state. For once, their space doesn't create conflict. For once, distance doesn't lead to emotional fallout. And in that quiet stability, something important begins to form. Trust. Not forced trust, not verbal trust, but the kind that grows from repeated emotional safety. Because when someone can stay grounded without punishing them, without chasing them, and without collapsing into fear, it changes the entire emotional environment of the relationship. They are no longer bracing for impact. They are no longer waiting for emotional consequences. They are no longer preparing to escape pressure. Instead, they are meeting something unfamiliar but deeply impactful: consistency. And in a world where they are used to extremes, that consistency stands out more than anything else. When you give them space without pulling your emotional presence out of the connection, what you're really communicating is simple. I'm here and I'm okay. And that message reaches deeper than words. It speaks directly to the part of them that fears being overwhelmed, controlled, or emotionally trapped. Because at their core, avoidant individuals don't just want distance, they want choice. They need to feel that closeness is something they can move toward freely, not something being applied to them under pressure. When you hold your own center with confidence, you create exactly that kind of environment. You give them room to move without turning that space into emotional loss or tension. You allow the connection to breathe instead of tightening around them. But this is where many people get it wrong. They think giving space means disappearing, going cold, shutting down emotionally, or acting like they no longer care. That is not emotional space. That is withdrawal. And avoidant people feel that difference immediately. When you go cold, it feels like rejection. When you go silent, it feels like punishment. When you remove your warmth, it doesn't create safety. It reinforces their belief that closeness eventually leads to emotional pain. And that belief becomes stronger. It's safer not to rely on anyone. True emotional space is something very different. It is staying present without pressure. It is keeping your warmth without chasing. It is not shrinking yourself, and it is not trying to fix the discomfort by over-explaining or overreaching. It's remaining steady while still being open. You continue living your life. You stay grounded in your own emotional balance. You don't make your worth dependent on how close or distant someone else is in a given moment. And that kind of presence becomes something like a lighthouse. Not pulling them in forcefully, not following them into distance, but staying visible and steady while they move through their own emotional rhythm. Most avoidant individuals are not used to that. They are far more familiar with two extremes: people who panic when they pull away, or people who shut down and use silence as punishment. Both create emotional weight. Both create pressure in different forms. So when they meet someone who does neither, someone who stays calm, warm, and self-contained, it stands out immediately, because emotional steadiness is rare, and it signals something important. You are safe to be yourself here, without managing someone else's emotional reactions. That is deeply disarming for them. Holding your space like this doesn't mean tolerating anything or ignoring your own needs. It means you are not abandoning yourself in order to regulate the connection. You are not turning anxiety into action. You are not letting uncertainty control your behavior. You stay anchored in who you are, even when the emotional situation feels unclear. And in doing so, something subtle but powerful happens. The dynamic stops feeling like pressure versus pursuit. It stops feeling like emotional tug of war. It starts to feel like two separate people who can exist in connection without losing themselves. That is where trust begins to form. Not from intensity, but from consistency. Not from chasing, but from stability. Avoidant individuals often carry an internal expectation that closeness will eventually become overwhelming. So when they experience someone who does not turn their distance into panic, they begin to see a different possibility: connection without emotional suffocation. And that changes how they relate to you. At the same time, something shifts within you too. You stop reacting from fear. You stop trying to control outcomes. You stop abandoning your emotional center just to keep someone close. You begin to trust your own steadiness. You begin to value emotional regulation over emotional reaction. And that creates a quiet strength that is felt, even if it is never spoken about directly. They notice when you don't panic. They notice when you don't over-explain. They notice when you don't turn silence into crisis. They notice when you don't chase their distance. And that consistency becomes unfamiliar in the best way possible. Because instead of becoming another emotional responsibility they have to manage, you become someone they can simply exist around without pressure. And that is where real safety begins. Not in forcing closeness, but in creating the kind of emotional environment where closeness no longer feels like a threat. They expect you to assume the worst, to turn silence into rejection. But someone grounded doesn't do that. They don't spiral or overthink. They understand behavior is about the other person, not their worth. That steadiness is relieving for avoidants who fear emotional responsibility. When you don't panic or chase, you show you can hold yourself. That breaks their pattern of expecting pressure. Instead of chaos, they meet calm. Instead of demand, they meet space. And that safety is what makes connection possible. Someone who is grounded in themselves gives an avoidant the space to exist without feeling like the relationship has to carry the full weight of their identity. That's what makes them feel safe enough to stay and not run. That's where trust begins. When an avoidant meets someone who is not trying to fix them, decode them, or constantly analyze them, something shifts. Because they can sense when there is an unspoken agenda like, if I can just get them to change, everything will be okay. Even if it comes from care, it still feels like pressure. And for someone used to being misunderstood, that pressure feels unsafe. So they withdraw, not because they don't care, but because they are protecting their space. But when they meet someone who simply lets them be, without pushing or forcing emotional exposure, They experience real acceptance. Not fake patience, not hidden expectations, but genuine acceptance that says, you don't need to perform or be fixed here. That kind of presence calms their nervous system. They stop bracing for pressure. They stop expecting emotional demands. For once, they can exist in the connection without feeling overwhelmed. Avoidant people are not without emotion. They just move at a different pace. They don't reject intimacy, they regulate toward it. They need safety first and choice second. When closeness is chosen, not forced, they open up naturally. Most of them have lived with labels like too distant or too hard to understand, so they expect judgment or correction. But when someone doesn't treat them like a problem to solve, they feel something rare, emotional safety without conditions. And in that safety, they don't shut down, they start to show up. Not because they were pushed, but because they finally feel safe enough to stay. And in that kind of calm, they don't feel trapped by closeness anymore. They feel safe enough to choose it, and that's what makes them stay.